in the news recently, this past week, the news broke that the reparations lawsuit in the Tulsa case with one of the oldest living survivors, uh, Viola Fletcher, was thrown out by the judge in the case. And we did a show a couple of years ago where we actually covered Viola Fletcher when she did her testimony in front of Congress seeking justice for what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in her community. And Baba Makru, I want you to really break down not just what happened, but give us your insight on what happened with this case and why it fell through.
Well, it would be good to know exactly, why the judge allowed the lawsuit to go through based on the public nuisance law, and then decided that they didn't have grounds for a suit. But I think most of the listeners of African Liberation Media are familiar with the history, but for those who may not be, uh, this incident known as the Tulsa Race Massacre, sometimes called a riot, which it was not a riot. It was not a urban rebellion in the case of, for example, of Watts or South Central Los Angeles in 1965, or Detroit in 1967, and the 200 cities that exploded after Dr. King was killed in 1968. It was not that type of situation. This was a clear-cut race massacre that started for the most simple reason, but the white supremacist dynamic just doesn't, they can use anything for an excuse to attack African people. There was a 19-year-old young person of African descent named Dick Rowland, who was working at a shoe shine stand in downtown Tulsa. He had to use the restroom, but there were no restrooms available for people of African descent in the building that he was working in. So he had to walk to the Drexel building, which the owner of the shoe shine stand had been given permission to allow his African employees to use a segregated restroom on the third floor. This was doing, like I said, this is in May. This actually was on May 30th of 1921. At the time, elevators had what they call operators. They were manually operated. And Dick Rowland got on the elevator, and there was a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page who was operating the elevator. Now, I'm sure he was apprehensive about getting on the elevator, but he also, had permission to be there, and, he needed to go and get back to work. At some point during the transportation, you got a lot of different stories as to exactly what happened. Some say the elevator kind of jerked. Some said that that it wasn't level when it stopped. It wasn't level with the floor. Dick Rowland apparently stumbled or brushed or accidentally bumped into this white woman, and she screamed. And when she screamed, obviously Rowland was scared, so he ran and was seen running out of the building. The accidental bump or brush, or some people said he stepped on a toe, was quickly escalated into an assault on a white woman. And so the next day, on May 31st, Dick Rowland was arrested. Now, the white woman, and I don't know exactly if she said this immediately or subsequently after the fact, said that there was no reason to prosecute Dick Rowland. Nothing happened. But the one of the white supremacist newspapers in Tulsa, I think it was the Tulsa Tribune, probably saw this as an opportunity to incite white people to attack the thriving Greenwood community. African people had been moving into Oklahoma. Oklahoma had more black towns after the Civil War than any state in the United States. The Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa was founded in 1906 by a brother named O.W. Gurley. Many of the people who moved there had actually lived in Greenwood, Mississippi. And so that's where the town got its, the community got its name from. At this point, it was an unincorporated part of the thriving Tulsa community. Tulsa was thriving because of the oil boom. There were a lot of oil wells working there, and a lot of people becoming rich as the nation industrialized. And so when Oklahoma was admitted to the United States in 1907 as a state, it quickly passed a law, Senate Bill number 1, which completely segregated the African and European communities. So African people took advantage of the forced segregation and started, building their own community. Many initially went to work, for white people doing various things, like black women as domestics and others. But they saved their money and began to build their own community. And this turned the community by 1921 into what was considered to be the most thriving, economically successful African community. Booker T. Washington, and we can disagree with the name he chose, he called it Black Wall Street. I don't think we want to copy the name of the bastion of capitalism. Some people now call it the Greenwood Financial District. Obviously, it was a class community. About 30% of the Africans who lived there were homeowners, which is a high percentage certainly for African people in 1921, and even probably higher than many African communities in the United States today. So I think they saw this accidental brush as an attempt, as an opportunity to destroy the thriving community, because the actual standard of living and median income of the Africans in the Greenwood community was higher than many white people in the Tulsa community. Some statisticians say even higher than the average white person. It's kind of hard to believe with the oil oligarchs there, but nevertheless, the Tulsa Tribune printed an article that said that a white woman had been assaulted, and the black man that did it needed to be lynched. Okay, so that's the background, roughly that sets up what happened. When the newspaper was printed, black men, initially about 20, armed themselves. A lot of these people were World War I veterans, had just returned from fighting in Europe. They went down to offer their services to the sheriff. The sheriff said he didn't need their services, but at the same time, there was a growing crowd of armed white people. So they went back to their community and came down, this time about 75 strong. Many of these Africans were dressed in their World War I uniforms. Different stories, but the most common story is that a white man attempted to grab one of the guns of one of the black veterans was holding. The gun accidentally fired. That set off a shootout where about 12 people were killed. The armed black men retreated to their neighborhood. They knew what was coming. And sure enough, with white people pouring into Tulsa from the surrounding communities, they launched a massacre. Now, black men did fight bravely, including J.B. Stratford, the owner of the largest black-owned hotel in the United States at the time. He and his son climbed to the top of their hotel and fired. Many others fired. There's one guy, his name I can't remember. They call Peg Leg. I can't remember his last name now. He was credited with taking down about 12 Europeans. But generally speaking, the community was not prepared for the assault. And you may want to question the wisdom, of going down armed to protect Dick Rowland, and then not being prepared for the assault. But property is very difficult to protect. I mean, what happened was white people bought in machine guns, perhaps Gatling guns. They still had some available from the 1870s, 80s, or whatever. White business people, whites who owned airplanes, armed the airplanes with dynamite and petrol bombs. And the end result was about the thriving community between 35 and 40 square blocks was absolutely leveled. The estimates initially, they said, only 30 to 40 African people were killed. Eventually, they upped it to 300, but many people say that they really don't know the total number. It could be as high as 3,000 people of African descent. The three elders who testified before Congress in 2021 were all very young at the time. And they tell their stories about how their parents gathered them with basically what they were wearing. If they had some type of transportation, they fled, tried to get out of the Greenwood community. But they also saw horrible things. There are just so many stories about how white people trapped families in homes and set homes on fire. I remember a story of one brother talking about three of his young friends who were the same age as he was. I think he was about 6 at the time, burned up in their homes. So it was just an absolute a massacre of African people. The famed attorney Charles Ogletree, who was teaching at Harvard, one of the most brilliant legal minds the African American community has ever produced, filed a lawsuit in 2005, which had, I want to say at the time, over 100 survivors. See, the number one argument that's always used against African people when it comes to reparations in relationship to chattel slavery is that there are no survivors. No African person living today was a survivor of chattel slavery. Interestingly enough, this only seems to apply to African people. It certainly doesn't apply to Jews, like the Jews that Barack Obama helped in 2014, which the reparations that he got, $60 million from France, was paid to not only survivors, but descendants and heirs. So, but in Ogletree's case, they had actual survivors. That case was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. So they came back. Attorney Solomon Simons came back with a new lawsuit centered around the three still surviving members. One 109, one 108, and the other I think is 102. They're actually hoping that these people die. But nevertheless, they brought the lawsuit. The judge allowed the lawsuit and then suddenly said that they didn't have grounds for the lawsuit based on the public nuisance law. So I think there are a lot of lessons to learn here, but I think one of the greatest is that it's not just the Supreme Court. Right, because we had this big issue recently about the Supreme Court overturning affirmative action in the colleges and universities based on the suit filed by quote Asian Americans who say they were denied admittance to Harvard and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill because of affirmative action. It's not just the Supreme Court. It's not just the Clarence Thomas. He's not the Chief Justice, but really he seems to be, when it comes to race, the most influential. When it came before the Supreme Court in 2005, the Ogletree case, they refused to hear it. So they came back with a new lawsuit, which a judge down there, her name is Caroline Wall. She dismissed the lawsuit filed by the three survivors, as I mentioned: Viola Fletcher, 109, Leslie Randall, 108, and Hugh Van Ellis, 102. Um, so, according to reporting from the Associated Press, the lawsuit was brought under Oklahoma's public nuisance law, claiming that the lives lost and damages suffered from white supremacist attack continue to impact the city to the present day. Now, there have been a number of studies that have shown the economic impact, because the community today would, in today's numbers, would be worth somewhere close to $50 million in worth, if I have my numbers correctly. But the lawsuit was tossed, and they're going to challenge it. They're going to file an appeal. But once again, you're caught in this cycle where you may go from this local court to a court of appeals to a federal court, and then to the Supreme Court. The bottom line is that we just can't rely on one area of power if we expect to achieve anything close to justice in the United States. As difficult as that may be, if we had a broader scope that included culture, communications, economics, education, and then various aspects of politics, I think we would have a better chance. But this is the way it is at this particular moment. Overwhelmingly, we are just focused on one area of politics, law, of course, being part of that. But it just goes to show, I mean, even when we meet all of the standards that they say we're supposed to meet, we still don't succeed.
Well, I think this is what goes into what Amos talked about when he discussed power and laws, and how laws can change at any time based upon the current conditions of what the people who have the power want the laws to be. Mm-hmm. So they can continue to move the goalposts, and they're also very crafty in their decision making processes, just even based around acknowledging being wrong or apologizing for a situation. Recently, the current Dutch king, apologized for the Netherlands' role that it played in slavery. And also, Ugandan President Museveni apologized for the role that African nations played in slavery, and invited Africans in the diaspora to come back home to Uganda. But when you talk about apologizing, I think even when the African countries apologize, there has to be a serious step forward, a serious foot put forward with opening up the door for dual citizenship as a sense of reparations to Black people who lost the connection with their families and lost land that they previously had access to. But in the United States, the House of Representatives apologized to slavery back in 2008. But in 2009, when a bill was brought forth to Congress to have an official apology for slavery, it never passed. So during the time of the so-called first Black president, the United States government still rejected the opportunity to officially apologize for slavery, because they know that it sets a legal precedent for them to be held accountable. If you acknowledge that you were wrong, then you have to be held accountable for your wrongdoings and your actions. And in this case with Sister Fletcher, they're willing to bank on the fact that, or hope, they're willing to hope that she won't live long enough for the case to reach the Supreme Court,
Right.
which will then make the case null and void.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. Null and void when it comes to us. Right.
right. And this is how these people think. And I'm glad you pointed out the fact about the Tulsa Tribune, because a lot of people miss that fact in realizing just how powerful media plays a role
Hmm.
in people's reactions to things. We discussed on this podcast some time ago. We talked about how they were playing up these black prosecutors to go after Donald Trump, and
Hmm.
how the media was playing a role in trying to gaslight the situation, which could then lead to more violence
Hmm.
by trying to insinuate that whites were going to go out and commit these violent acts. Well, that's similar to what you saw in that newspaper where they pretty much wrote a headline telling the whites what to do,
Exactly. That
and they went
that's
out
a
and
story that's
did it.
repeated all over, the United States, during the era of that type of lynching.
Hmm. So in many cases, most people go about their daily life not wanting to be involved in these types of things, but you have people who are painting the narrative and writing the narrative to get these reactions out of people.
Hmm.
So in many cases, the Tulsa Tribune, which I believe, I don't know if it's even still a newspaper now, but the owners of the families who own that newspaper should be held liable and have to pay reparations for the damages that they
Exactly.
caused that community. And if that family is still alive and they still have the wealth that was built off of owning and running that media company, that newspaper outlet, they should be held accountable,
Absolutely.
because you pretty much slandered a man who the police at the time thought was innocent and was going to plan to drop the charges against.
Exactly. I mean, and even Sarah Page wrote a letter saying that she would not press charges against Dick Rowland. She wrote a letter and fled town because she was probably scared of what white people would do to her. And so, yeah, that's why we included communications as one of the five critical areas of power. That's exactly why. But I mean, the other thing, like I said, I mean, to get any justice, you have to have power. I mean, how is it that the Obama administration in 2014 is fighting, for reparations to be paid to Jews by France? What drove them, the Obama administration, which wouldn't bring charges against George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin, or Timothy Loehmann, who killed Tamir Rice, or Darren Wilson, who killed Michael Brown Jr., right? Obama himself on record as saying that reparations were a thing of the past. But here they are fighting to get these reparations for Jews uh, as a result of things that happened in Europe in the 1940s. And they said that the payments would be made not just to survivors who had settled in the United States, Israel, and Canada, and other countries, but to their heirs. So what about the survivors only standard? Okay, it doesn't apply. So, but here once again, you're talking about a power dynamic. When you're talking about Americans who of the Jewish faith, right? And that's the part. That's what
Well,
we don't seem to understand.
right. And Sister Viola Fletcher's life has already been negatively affected and impacted by what happened in the race massacre in Tulsa. and now even at an elderly age, she's still being disrespected by the United States judicial system.